In the early 1960s, Maspeth, Queens was a quiet, working-class neighborhood where electricians and factory workers raised families in modest row houses. At 5211 72nd Street lived a couple the neighbors absolutely adored. Russell Ryan was a union electrician. His wife, Hermine, worked at a local knit factory. She had a thick Austrian accent, a warm smile, and such a love for dogs that she would stop to pet any puppy that walked past, cooing to it in German. People considered her one of the kindest women they knew. Russell had met her in Austria years earlier. She told him almost nothing about her past, only that the war years had been difficult, that she had done things she wasn't proud of, and that she wanted to start fresh. Russell was a simple man who believed he had found a good woman. He didn't press for details. They lived the American dream for nearly a decade, hosting backyard cookouts and attending church. But this quiet, normal life was a complete fabrication built over a hidden, monstrous past. On July 12, 1964, at 7 in the morning, a New York Times reporter named Joseph Lelyveld arrived at the Ryan home. He was acting on a tip from Vienna. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, had tracked a woman to Queens. When Lelyveld knocked, Hermine answered the door holding a paint roller, dressed in pink striped shorts and a white blouse. The reporter asked if she was Hermine Braunsteiner, a former guard at the Majdanek concentration camp. Her face froze. She dropped the roller, ran into the house screaming for her husband, and sobbed in German, "This is the end." Russell came to the door. He had slept beside this woman every night for 6 years. Confronted by a stranger accusing his wife of war crimes, Russell responded immediately, without a single hesitation. "My wife would not hurt a fly. She's an angel. There's no more decent person on this earth." He meant every word. And his reaction raises a deeply unsettling question. What happens when a simple man's absolute devotion is forced to collide head-on with documented historical evil? The woman Russell married was known during the war as the Stomping Mare of Majdanek. The nickname came from her footwear, heavy jackboots with iron tips. Hundreds of survivor testimonies described her using those boots to kick prisoners in the stomach and throat. She whipped pregnant women to death. In one instance, a survivor watched Hermine discover a child hidden by his mother, beat the boy until he whimpered, and drag him by his hair to a truck bound for the gas chambers. But the detail that makes Russell's denial so baffling is that Hermine had already been caught. In November 1949, an Austrian court found her guilty of war crimes, and she served 3 years in prison. Her clean slate came in 1957. A partial amnesty effectively erased her record on paper, creating the legal loophole she needed to immigrate to North America, marry Russell, and eventually become a U.S. citizen. Russell either didn't know about the Austrian conviction, or he knew and didn't care. He lived his life beside a woman who volunteered for brutality, an enthusiastic participant in genocide who had already stood trial once. By the 1970s, the U.S. government stripped her citizenship and deported her to Germany. The third Majdanek trial began in Düsseldorf in November 1975. It became the longest Nazi war crimes trial in German history. It lasted 474 days. The prosecution assembled 100 accordion files containing 20,000 pages of evidence. In the courtroom, 400 Holocaust survivors took the stand. They pointed directly at Hermine, identifying her as the woman who murdered their mothers, sisters, and children. While they testified, Hermine sat in the Hendenstock knitting, working on crossword puzzles and reading American newspapers, utterly detached. The trial produced a quantifiable physical archive of proof. Any reasonable path to denial had been systematically dismantled by 20,000 pages of evidence. Russell took time off work, flew to Germany, and sat in the gallery twice a week in a blue corduroy cap. He heard every gruesome detail. But instead of accepting the truth, he actively rewrote it. He told reporters she had been forced to serve and claimed she was an innocent victim of a corrupt court. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. It's a defense mechanism where the human brain protects itself from unacceptable realities by aggressively deflecting or warping incoming facts to fit a conclusion it has already reached. But Russell pushed this to a terrifying logical extreme. To maintain his belief that his wife was an angel, he had to genuinely convince himself that 400 separate Holocaust survivors had coordinated their lies to frame her. It shows the horrifying capability of love. When a person's entire reality is built on unconditional devotion, facts, logic, and even overwhelming historical evidence are ultimately powerless to penetrate it. The verdict finally came down in June 1981. Of the 9 defendants, Hermine was the only one sentenced to life in prison. The court explicitly cited her uniquely severe cruelty and her visible enthusiasm for violence. Russell's response was not acceptance. It was a deeper commitment. For the next 2 decades, he maintained a long, quiet vigil. He visited her regularly in prison, collected signatures from their old neighbors in Queens vouching for her character, and told anyone who would listen that Germany had stolen his wife. While Russell waited, Hermine physically deteriorated behind bars. Her untreated diabetes worsened, eventually requiring the amputation of her left leg below the knee. There is something deeply tragic and deeply unsettling about the sheer endurance of Russell's delusion. Long after the victims had spoken, long after the evidence was weighed, and long after the world had closed the case, one man kept the fiction alive. In April 1996, German authorities granted Hermine a medical pardon. She was 76 years old, missing a leg, and severely diabetic. She was released to a subsidized apartment in Bochum, Germany, to live out her final days in Russell's care. Later that year, a journalist found the couple. The image he captured is haunting. Russell was pushing his wife in a wheelchair through a wet, bustling European marketplace. He would stop at the vendor stalls, methodically picking through the groceries, and ask her which flower she would prefer. Hermine never responded. She just sat wrapped in a blanket, staring straight ahead in total silence. After 35 years of fighting the world, of fiercely defending her humanity and insisting she was an angel, Russell was left caring for a woman who could no longer confirm or deny anything. The person he had protected no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Hermine died in 1999, and Russell took his defense of her to his own grave. We will never know if love truly blinded him to absolute evil, or if the fiction was simply the only way his mind survived. All he left behind is the unbearable weight of refusing to see.